Hi, Sally. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Great. Well, we're both pleased to be here to present a new episode of Reflections on the History of Modeling and Theory. This is part of the Society for Modeling and Theory in Population Biology, and it's one of a series in fairly informal conversations. Our goal is to meet with leading figures who really shaped this field and hear something about how that happened. With Sally and the technical wizardry of Kaylee Charlebois, one of the graduate students who has worked with Sally at UBC, we are now delighted to welcome James, known generally as Jim Brown. Jim Brown is currently a distinguished professor emeritus at the University of New Mexico. He's been associated with a bunch of other institutions during his career, including University of Arizona, the Santa Fe Institute, and he started off as an undergraduate at Cornell University. So he received his bachelor's degree in zoology in 1963 from Cornell, and then moved on to a PhD also in zoology at the University of Michigan. Took in multiple stops along the way, spending then the largest part of his career at University of New Mexico, where he retired from.
And Jim has an enormous number of accolades for all of the work that he's done across his career. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Association of Science, the National Academy. He's won one of the most prestigious ecological awards from the Ecological Society of America, the Robert H. MacArthur Award. And I also want to highlight how he's contributed to the field, for example, by serving as the president of the Ecological Society of America.
Yeah, that's right. A really big influence on ESA and a big influence on the field of theoretical ecology and multiple areas of ecology more broadly. If you look up his Google Scholar page, you'll see 130,000 odd citations.
Wow.
And obviously that number is huge, but there are really substantial lasting contributions in multiple areas. And as you can imagine, that's very broad if we were to list out all of Jim's papers, but I'm just going to pick out a few of the highlights that have been influential for me, I think, over the years. And these fall into metabolic theory of ecology, then a lot of long-term ecological research focused on desert ecology, and then what you could call a new field or subfield of ecology known as macroecology. And thinking about his summary of the first of those, the metabolic theory of ecology, there is an absolutely classic paper from 2004, and this is associated with one of the awards that Sally mentioned, the MacArthur Award from the Ecological Society of America. And so it's a paper associated with that award. That's been cited 9,000 times since
Wow.
it was published, and for good reason, because it's the paper to go to to learn about metabolic theory, both the state of the art at the time in 2004, but I think also it raises questions and research themes that are still ongoing and important today. So that's why it's still read and still cited. Thinking about the desert ecology work, multiple long-term studies started and continued by Jim, which I think have formed an early model of really important long-term ecological research on population dynamics and community dynamics. And then the last of these areas, macroecology, I found a quote online saying Jim Brown is considered the father of macroecology. So I don't know if he would say that himself, but because he's probably got a degree of modesty about his achievements, but I think at the very least we could call him a parent of macroecology would be a very fair statement. And so he'll tell us a little bit more about each of these areas, I'm sure, during our questions today. So Jim, I'd like to thank you for being with us here today.
Jim, welcome. When did you first realize that quantitative methods had such an important role to play in ecology?
I guess I really realized it very early on in my graduate career at the University of Michigan, although I can't say that I really did that much with it for quite a while. But I was always interested in adaptation. And as a graduate student, it occurred to me that perhaps one of the ways to get a quantitative handle on adaptation and how it related to fitness was to do physiology, because physiologists actually measured the performance of organisms. So I did my PhD thesis on adaptation to temperature in some populations of pack rats. And I also then was introduced to the early models of energy exchange that underlies endothermy, maintenance of body temperature in mammals and birds. And you know, I had this idea that we could quantify some of these things that were hard to quantify, but that were conceptually important ideas by doing physiology and measuring things on real organisms, and in particular, investigating the energetics that underlies the traits of many organisms.
Right, right. And so you could see a quantitative connection there almost by going to a different field.
Well, I mean, that was my field initially.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, Robert MacArthur would say that I only became a real ecologist a couple of years after I got my doctorate. Before that, I was a physiologist.
And that's great to see how that training, that cross training, really permeated your career.
Yeah. You know, and the first model that I really identified with, which is still one of my most favorite models, is what we call the Scholander-Irving model of energetics for an endotherm, which graphs metabolic rate as a function of body temperature, and has to do with you know, energy balance basically, and temperature regulation.
When did you do that model?
I didn't do it; they did. I just applied it.
Yes,
I just used it. I mean, the three most influential models early in my career were that one during my graduate work, and then during graduate times or shortly thereafter, MacArthur and Wilson's equilibrium model of island biogeography, and thirdly, the Fretwell and Lucas model for fitness as a function of population density and how organisms pack into different habitats. And I mean, all three of those models can be portrayed as graphical models without getting too much into equations, which I don't do equations very well, but I do graphs and spatial relations much better.
And those all have pretty deep conceptual messages to them, all those papers. Yeah.
That might lead into my question, which is, maybe it's going to be the people writing those papers or developing those models, or not. It could be somebody else, but we're wondering who the people were, either through personal interactions or through their research, inspired you early on in your career.
Okay, so early on, when I was doing my PhD work, I think the big inspiration as far as quantitative stuff and models was Bill Dawson, who was a physiological ecologist at the University of Michigan and a very well-known environmental physiologist, right? And then I went from Michigan to a postdoc with George Bartholomew at UCLA. And Bartholomew was a very, very eminent biologist, also a physiological ecologist. I mean, he was a member of the National Academy, and in many ways, he was perhaps one of the most influential people in my whole academic career. And you know, with sort of everything of, you know, how to get along in academia, how to do science, how to publish, all of that sort of thing, as well as one of the things that he really drilled into me was having a background in natural history. And so he really encouraged me to use my knowledge of natural history and continue to develop that as a supplement to my natural tendency to get into the deeper, more general conceptual issues that apply to lots of different kinds of organisms. You know, I mean, I have this dictum, and I don't know if I got this directly from Bart, but it's, you know, that nature bats last. The natural history, you know, all of our theory ultimately has to answer to what real organisms do in the real world.
So he kind of kept you on the ground at that early stage. Is that a fair way to put it?
Yeah, right. And yeah, I guess so. And then also, just at that same time, Martin Cody, who was a student of Robert MacArthur's, had MacArthur out to UCLA for a visit, and I met MacArthur, and we got along really well. And so Robert MacArthur sort of adopted me in many ways, and sort of encouraged my transition to what he called real ecology, which is population and community ecology. And he had me to Princeton, and you know, I spent quite a few extended periods either in the field or walking around Princeton, interacting with MacArthur, and he continued to encourage my inclination to want to generalize this stuff and to develop models for it, although I wasn't at that time very good at it.
Maybe it was then, maybe it was later, but do you have a favorite aha moment, a memory of a model or a theoretical or conceptual advance where the model really helped you see the world in a different way?
Yeah, I do. I think, I mean, I think that aha moment came mostly after I was a assistant professor at the University of Utah, and my wife Astrid and I taught a field course in Mexico or southern Arizona, where students went out in the field and did projects. And one year the students did a project where we all went out and examined turnover of arthropods, insects and spiders and things, on individual thistle plants that were flowering. And the thistle plants differed in their size and their distances from each other. And so it occurred to us that we could view this as sort of a model, an empirical model of island biogeography.
Right.
So we collected all these data and we took them back to Utah. And shortly after we got back, Steve Fretwell came for a visit. And we had worked the data up and found that the data generally followed the predictions of MacArthur and Wilson's model, except that turnover rates were really low on nearby islands. And so Esther and I met in my office with Steve Fretwell, and we showed him the data, and the data were really convincing that turnover actually went down with colonization. And Steve said, well, this is great, you know, but I won't believe it unless we can do a model. And Astrid and I said, okay, can we do a model? And so we went to my blackboard and we started drawing different lines for islands of different sizes and isolation.
Right.
And the model that ultimately came out to be the model that presents our rescue effect in island biogeography that sort of fell out there beautifully. And so and we were really impressed, and we encouraged Steve to become a co-author with us on the paper. And he said, oh, no, you know, I can't do this. This is your work and so forth. And it might have been about the time he was getting ready to leave biology and go become a religious nut down on the coast of Texas. I don't know. But anyway, you know, I mean, I guess for me, that was sort of the moment. That if you have these kinds of ideas and they have merit and they're general, you should be able to put them into some kind of a rigorous model that writes things down in terms of equations or at least linear relationships, and which leads to testable hypotheses in additional systems.
Right.
That's really cool. And we will definitely put that paper up on the channel once this interview goes out, just in case people want to take a look at that.
That was one of, ultimately that became one of my and Esther's and my most famous papers. But it was also interesting that it was rejected by two journals, Evolution, where we sent it because that's where MacArthur and Wilson's original paper came out, and AmNat, and it got very negative reviews. And finally, we sent it to Ecology, and Gordon Oriens was the editor. He got one very negative review back. Gordon saved it, and that became the rescue effect, which is now so widely accepted and used in conservation biology and biogeography that people don't even bother to cite our original paper anymore.
So in contrast to that paper, we are wondering if there's a favorite paper of yours that did not get to be well known, or that you wish was better known or deserved to be better known.
Yeah, I thought about that question. I think, the paper I would point to is a paper that I did on, and I can't remember where it was published, American Zoologist, maybe. It was entitled Homage to Santa Rosalia. Why are there so many species? I think something like that.
I've read it, yeah.
And that paper sort of tried to make the point, maybe not as convincingly as it could have, that underlying a lot of biodiversity in some very important way is energetics, that organisms have to get enough energy from somewhere to be able to maintain populations, and it pointed out, a pattern that I thought was convincing. At least it might have merited some further discussion between the size of the geographic range and the body size of organisms, showing that large organisms have, all large organisms basically have large geographic ranges, whereas smaller organisms some of them have large ranges, but a lot of them have small ranges because they can persist in small ranges and still be abundant enough to avoid extinction. And that sort of led to the work that I did with Brian Maurer, the sort of all the stuff that we called macroecology, but it sort of preceded that, and it didn't get much attention.
But you're thinking about the packing and how that'll depend on the physiology and the size and natural history of the organism.
Exactly.
Yeah, neat. Well, I want to raise to the students listening that, even famous, eminent people got their papers rejected. So that's good to highlight. But do you have other advice for students, I think, about how they approach the interface of theory and natural history and data?
Well, I guess, for me, my whole career has been sort of going from one interest to another, and usually one thing led to another. And I just tried to keep doing it as best I could. I don't know if fearlessly is quite the right word, but, and I've always told people, including students, that I must be one of the least mathematically talented theoretical biologists on the planet. You know, I'm dyslexic and I don't do equations well at all. But what I do have is fairly good spatial relations, and I can handle the geometry and the graphical stuff. And excuse me. And you know, I've sort of learned to just trust that, you know, to go with my strength.
Hmm.
And the other message I would make is, you know, to find collaborators who can fill in those weak spots, those blind spots. So I collaborate, and since I'm a fairly old dude now, I mostly collaborate with younger people who can help me with the equation parts of the modeling. And, you know, I find that works really well, but it's, you know, I guess one of my bits of advice would be, you know, don't give up too soon if you think you have a neat idea. You know, keep pushing it. And a number of my most famous papers have been rejected the first time around. Non-equilibrium island biogeography, also some of our macroecological papers, and sort of related to this is, you know, the fact that Brian Maurer and I, you know, I think pretty much pioneered macroecology in many of its current manifestations. And yet, you know, we were never able to get a grant to do that work.
Huh.
You know, and this is like 5 years after our first AMNAP paper came out. And we keep getting reviewers of our proposals saying, well, you know, Brown should stick to his experimental studies of rodents and ants in the field, you know. He shouldn't go off this way in this direction and so forth. And so I guess another message I would be, you know, give is, you know, don't get discouraged too fast. You know, stick with your interests and your instincts. And, you know, I've also learned that some of my instincts have been wrong, and you've got to be willing to change your ideas. And, you know, when the evidence, the weight of evidence requires that, but also stick with things. And sometimes you don't have to change everything. Sometimes your ideas can have been part right, and it's a matter of tweaking or making even relatively major changes in the models and the theory that are required, you know, to eventually get it to the point where it's ready for prime time.
I think that's great advice. Oftentimes we do have to play with it, see models from different perspectives, and not give up.
Yeah, and the other thing you have to do is listen to your critics.
Yeah.
Because, you know, and figure out what they don't understand, and whether it's a matter of whether, you know, you actually disagree and you're going to agree to disagree, or whether you, in writing the paper or the grant, have just not been clear or convincing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, Jim, you mentioned work with Brian Maurer on developing macroecology really from the beginning, and we'll put up some papers as well on macroecology and also the metabolic theory of ecology. These are two just hugely influential frameworks that really have persisted from when you developed them through to current work. And so I'm wondering, can you tell us about how those developed, maybe the interplay of theory and data, what the inspirations were, maybe any interesting stories that came up as you were working on developing macroecology and metabolic theory?
Yeah, okay. So, you know, I did that 2 decades of homage paper, and at that time I was at the University of Arizona, and Brian Maurer took my community ecology class. And when Brian did that, he was a very traditional student in a very traditional wildlife biology program, working on some rare sparrow population in southeastern Arizona. But he took my class and he was just turned on. And he came into my office and you know, he string me for initially just some references and stuff to get up to speed. And then we started talking, and he had much better quantitative skills than I did. And so eventually, you know, it occurred to us, well, we can do this, right? And if we take the three most important, potentially very important attributes of an organism, its body size, its average local population density, and its area of geographic range, those provide three different sort of insights into a species characteristic. And we can get pretty good data on all three of those from what was then coming out as the Breeding Bird Survey, these people that were going around monitoring bird populations all over the US. And so, you know, Brian handled all the computer and stuff and the graphing, but we plotted those variables up. And, you know, so we plotted them pairwise, and there's an interesting story there actually, because we plotted them pairwise and they made these nice spaces. And we thought, well, let's plot it in 3 dimensions with all 3 of those variables. And turned out that when we did that, the points were so diffuse, you couldn't tell anything. We had this fancy computer program that would do that, but it didn't get us in. If you plotted it in 2 dimensions, you found these spaces with what looked like, you know, sort of well-filled spaces with lots of species in, and then these blank spaces that looked like they were very unlikely or impossible combinations of traits. And it suggested to us, especially with my energetic background, that some of those related to energetic constraints. And so we started drawing these as spaces with what we call constraint lines, which might have been absolute, impossible, or they might have been relative constraints that were just, you know, unlikely. As populations would get below that, they would become increasingly subject to stochastic extinction. You know, and so Brian and I worked together on that stuff for a long time, and it was just a, you know, it was really a very productive collaboration. But as I said, interestingly enough, we were never able to get grant support for that. Then you know, body size kept coming out over and over again as an important characteristic of species that's related to macroecological patterns. And so that, you know, got me into Damon's paper, the equal energetics and equal energy use ideas and so forth that James is very familiar with. And at some point, somebody said, well, you know, if this is related to metabolic rate, how does metabolic rate scale with body size? And so I got a bit more into the literature on that and into Kleiber's law, you know, and why metabolic rate should or might not scale as mass to the 3/4 power, because the 3/4 power is not something that's absolutely transparent. And that led to my collaboration with Jeffrey West and Brian Enquist and the group at the Santa Fe Institute and all the scaling relations. And, subsequent to that, I've tried to consolidate some of this stuff into some kind of a general theory of the sort of energetic underpinnings of biodiversity, and trying to answer the question of, well, what aspects of biodiversity think we can understand pretty well with energetics, and what parts still remain to be investigated.
No, Jim, I've looked at the Dameth's law paper and other work related, and Kleiber's law, the original papers on that. And something I don't know, I'm just interested in your earlier career as a physiological ecologist. Was Kleiber's law something you were familiar with, or was interesting, or did it not really come up till later on?
Yeah, we always knew that there was this roughly 3/4 power, and other people did quite a lot of work showing that it really was much closer to 3/4 than 2/3, and so forth. But I think it's fair to say, in the literature of physiological ecology, it never really got explained. And to be honest, I'm not sure that we've explained it yet. uh, uh, Jeffrey West thinks that our fractal-like model accounts for it, but there are a lot of organisms out there that show 3/4 scaling of respiratory rate or metabolic rate with body mass that don't appear to be at all fractal-like, that don't have the obviously fractal-like systems. And I've kind of come to the hypothesis that really what may be going on, and I don't know how to deal with this, I don't have that physics background to deal with it, that what that 3/4 scaling is actually telling us is that there's actually a fourth dimension, and that fourth dimension, I think, is biological time, which isn't explicit in the metabolic stuff, right? But that's how long the machine that's metabolizing at this rate lives. That scales as a quarter power, an additional quarter power. And, but that's very airy-fairy, and I haven't been able to formalize that, or to find the right collaborator to be able to get that into a rigorous model.
That's interesting. So then the work with Jeff West, which we'll also post, that would be kind of a special case, maybe, of that more general picture.
Exactly.
More general conceptual picture.
I think that the models that we did they're beautiful, and they really use Jeff's background in classical physics, like hydrodynamics and stuff, as well as his background in scaling theory. But what they tell me is that if metabolic rate, for some other reason, fundamentally scales as a 3/4 power of mass, then you ask the question, well, how do the organisms deliver metabolic resources at a rate that's going to sustain that metabolic rate? And these fractal-like distributions, these fractal-like systems are very, very good at addressing that. I think our model does a really nice job of saying, well, if metabolic rate scales as mass to 3/4, how does the mammalian cardiovascular system branch and to supply resources at that rate? And I think I'm still very, very proud of that stuff. I mean, you don't always get it right the first time, right? As I tell my students, Darwin didn't have his genetics right. I don't think we need to make apologies for not getting everything absolutely perfect the first time we do a model.
And this is making me think that about recent papers that have been looking at the evolution of this scaling power, and maybe there's patterns there that we could look at about just how fractal are the circulatory systems, or as you say, how does time play a role in?
Yeah, I think that the time thing is really important. I mean, because you have this machine, right? I mean, and it's converting energy at a particular rate, right? But it doesn't last forever.
Right.
It eventually runs down, and and that's another important dimension that's not in our model, or and I don't know any framework that really puts that in there in a way that I find compelling yet.
Right. Fascinating. Well, this is a good inspiration. Students get working.
Yeah, right. Yeah, collaborate with a theoretical physicist, right? Yeah, get a good collaboration between some good biologists and some good theoretical physicists.
Like, how does this matter if it's annual or perennial, that type of question?
Yep.
Yep. Jim, models are so different. Every single model varies. Some are very, like, they're technical, they make a technological breakthrough. Others are very conceptual. You've really done a lot of work on these more conceptual side of that balance. And actually, it kind of makes me wonder a little bit if there can be a danger too for myself. I'm thinking spending too much in the technical weeds and not coming back out to get those conceptual insights. Any thoughts there about having a good balance?
Well, yeah, I mean, with me, I don't know if it's a balance, because I just can't do the equations, right? And so, I've tended to plunge pretty quickly into the conceptual stuff, and to think about that, more geometrically and graphically. But I guess I'm a big believer that it has to work, and it has to be faithful to the designs that nature has given us. And there's definitely, a very important place for doing detailed models for that really get into the underlying details, because in a sense, a lot of these things really aren't details. They're really the fundamentals.
Right.
And, I mean, tell everybody, if you want to start working on metabolic ecology and scaling and stuff, start with a mass balance diagram. Take your organism and try to draw a mass balance diagram, because if you don't do that, it doesn't obey the law of physics, and it can't be right.
Right. And also, as you said before, the balance doesn't have to just be you. It can be you in collaboration with somebody that has the other strengths.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you look at my CV, it's just filled with collaborators, and almost all of them were younger. They were students or postdocs, and I've just feasted on them throughout my career, and I still am using Zoom to collaborate with I was on Zoom an hour and a half this morning with our current group.
That's an interesting comment on the technical side. Maybe, Sal, you were maybe thinking, does the technical side kind of take you away from the biological reality? Actually, Jim, I guess you're getting at the idea that sometimes that can be what keeps you grounded. Like, does this big conceptual idea, can it be made to work technically? And so that's maybe part of the interplay there.
Yeah, and the other thing about the technical stuff, and this even gets over into the empirical basis for the technical stuff, and this relates to a question that you asked toward the end, I think, sort of where do we go from here? I think one of the problems we have for a lot of the phenomena that I deal with is that we need actually more and better data.
Mm.
You know, we have, and I have shamelessly used many of these big electronic databases. But I think, you know, those should come with some user warnings. You know, I mean, if you're doing scaling relations on log scales, you can be off by a factor of 2. And if you've got variation over several orders of magnitude, it doesn't make much difference. But you know, some of this stuff we're doing now on the life history basis of energetics, you know, I think we really want to know how long organisms live in the field, right? And how many, for a mammal, we'd really like to know how many babies does a mammal wean, raise to independence in its lifetime, an average mammal that is replacing itself. And those data I think are really hard to come by, and a lot of them have big error bars that don't come with warning labels in the big databases.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that does bring me to this big last question, maybe related to some things you started to talk about already, Jim. What do you see as the big open questions in theoretical ecology? And also, do we have the right tools as of now to solve them? Or maybe the right tools and the right data? So what do we need to solve those big open questions?
Well, I do think that, I mean, I get a huge amount of my inspiration from data. And from that, you know, just plotting things and looking at what the shapes are and so forth. And so I do think we need good data. And I think it's been a bit unfortunate because of the way their reward system and so forth seem to have operated, that not only do people that do what, you know, might pass for esoteric mathematical theory not get all the credit they deserve, but I think a lot of, you know, there's not a lot of credit people who are doing intensive field studies for particular model organisms. And, you know, if those are done well, then your theory should be able to account for whatever results they get. And so that's an important issue. The conceptual thing that interests me still, and I don't, you know, is, I mean, I think our, what we call our equal fitness paradigm is sound, and it accounts for the physical basis of the Darwinian fitness of an individual, or we like to phrase it in terms of the cohort of a parent and offspring. But as I've talked to James some, what I don't yet understand is how that interfaces with the abundance and distribution, which are not traits in our equal fitness paradigm, right? And if you ask, you know, how long does a species persist? Well, you know, if it replaces itself one for one in terms of energetics and abundance and so forth, you know, if it actually does that, it's going to persist forever. But it is actually a member of a population that has some abundance and distribution that also affects its probability of persistence. And, you know, I'm a great admirer of Van Valen. I haven't mentioned that one yet. Of Van Valen's Red Queen and his zero-sum game of evolution for energy. And, you know, somehow I'd like to
Right.
be able or see people, encourage people to bring those two things together. So that we can, actually take the productivity of the earth or a particular patch of ground, or even just some shared resource that's shared by a bunch of species, and be able to understand, how that affects abundance and distribution, and how that feeds in to both the population and evolutionary dynamics and into the life history.
You're trying to link macroecology and macroevolution.
Exactly. Yeah. With Van Valen's insight,
Right.
that if we look out there are all these species out there, and they're coexisting because they're all equally fit.
But not at all periods in time.
Not at all periods in time, and they sure as heck aren't equally abundant, or
Right.
or they don't have equal body sizes or geographic ranges. Yeah.
And so that we should be able to predict how long will that lineage persist.
It would be nice. I'd
It would
love
be
for, I'm not going to do it. I'm too old, but I'd love for one of you or even younger people to, really make some major strides in answering that question.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, Jim, your inspiration and your, your views on how modeling plays a role in understanding natural history.
Right. Well, thank you for doing this. I've enjoyed it.
Good.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.